The coffee went cold before the talking stopped. 3 cups sat on a hotel lounge table, untouched, while instructors argued about who trained harder, who understood fighting better, and who would prove it when the right opportunity came. Downstairs beneath the same hotel, Bruce Lee had already found the laundry room and begun working. It was 1971 in a conference hotel with thin walls, dim corridors and carpets that smelled of cigarette smoke and old rain. The martial arts gathering had finished its first day. Men who had demonstrated all afternoon now sat in the lounge replaying their own importance in slower, more flattering sentences. They were not lazy men in the simple sense. Many had trained for years. Some had strong schools and loyal students. But that night, comfort had made them talkative. A man can become soft not because he stops training entirely, but because he starts confusing talking about training with the work itself. The loudest voice belonged to Malcolm Reed. Malcolm loved the word discipline. He used it the way other men use a title, often enough that people stopped asking whether the body behind it still paid the price. Beside him sat Frank Lyle, a former tournament fighter who told every story as if the best version of himself had been present. Another instructor, Joseph Park, nodded politely while adding small corrections that made his own experience sound deeper. Around them, younger students listened as if wisdom might arrive through smoke and opinion. Bruce sat with them for a short while after dinner. He listened more than he spoke. When asked about training, he said only, "Tomorrow is built before tomorrow." Malcolm laughed and said, "That sounds like something you say after you are already famous?" Bruce smiled faintly, then stood. No one noticed him leave at first. That is often how real discipline exits a room, without announcement. It does not ask the talkers to follow. It does not insult them by leaving. It simply goes where the work is possible. Bruce walked past the elevators, down the service stairs, and into the basement. The basement hallway was half lit, with laundry carts, stacked towels, a mop bucket, and the tired mechanical hum of hotel pipes. At the end was a storage room with enough open space for a man who did not need perfect conditions. Bruce pushed aside 2 crates, checked the floor, and took off his jacket. A young hotel porter named Samuel Ortiz saw him through the open door. Samuel was 20, thin, overworked, and quietly fascinated by the men upstairs. He had watched their demonstrations from the back wall earlier that day. They looked powerful under lights. Bruce looked different in the basement, less impressive at first glance, more serious. Bruce asked if using the room would cause trouble. Samuel said no, as long as he did not block the laundry carts. Bruce moved the crates farther back, making the space cleaner than he had found it. Samuel noticed, small respect is easier to see when nobody is paying for it. Upstairs, Malcolm was explaining that modern fighters lack patience. He tapped ash into a tray and said a real man must repeat basics until comfort disappears. The younger students nodded. Downstairs, Bruce repeated 1 step along the concrete floor until comfort actually disappeared. He moved forward, stopped, reset, moved again. No music, no applause, no mirror, no student pretending to understand. Just 1 line of footwork and the sound of breath against machinery. Samuel stood in the hallway holding a towel stack and slowly forgot he was supposed to be working. The movement looked too simple to matter. That made it harder to watch. A dramatic kick would have made sense to Samuel. A heavy strike would have matched the stories upstairs. But Bruce was drilling a small entry, again and again, as if the difference between ordinary and excellent lived in half an inch. After 10 minutes, Samuel asked, "Sir, why practice something so small?" Bruce did not stop immediately. He finished the repetition, then turned. "Because large mistakes are often small mistakes that were allowed to grow," he said. Samuel looked at the floor where Bruce's foot had landed. Upstairs, Frank Lyle was describing a fight from 7 years earlier. Each retelling made him faster, calmer, and more heroic. Nobody interrupted because men like hearing stories that let them feel experienced without sweating. Malcolm ordered more coffee. The first cups were already cold. Downstairs, Bruce's shirt began to darken with sweat. He moved from footwork to hand interception, striking lightly into a folded towel Samuel had hung over a pipe. The towel was not a heavy bag. It gave almost no satisfaction. That made the drill honest. It punished wasted motion with ugliness rather than sound. Samuel asked if he needed proper equipment. Bruce shook his head. Proper equipment helps, he said, but if a man needs perfect conditions to train, he is training his excuses. Samuel felt that sentence more than he understood it. He thought about how often he had promised himself he would start something when life became easier. The work continued. Foot, hand, reset. Foot, hand, reset. Sometimes Bruce stopped and corrected his shoulder. Sometimes he corrected his breathing. Sometimes he repeated the same movement slowly, then faster, then slowly again. There was no romance in it. That was why it looked real. In the lounge, the talk turned toward Bruce. Malcolm said he admired talent, but talent could make a man impatient. Joseph Park agreed that natural speed sometimes prevents depth. Frank said Bruce moved well, but the question was whether he could still work after years of praise. None of them knew the answer was moving beneath their feet. That is one of life's cleanest ironies. Men discussing another man's discipline while his discipline is happening close enough to hear if they would only stop talking. But talking has a way of filling the ears from the inside. At midnight, Samuel returned with fresh towels. Bruce was still there. The repetition had changed. Now he was working one short strike from a relaxed position, touching the towel, resetting, breathing, touching again. Samuel noticed he was not trying to make a loud sound. He was trying to make no extra sound. "Don't you get bored?" Samuel asked. Bruce looked at him with a tired smile. "Boredom is often the gatekeeper," he said. "Most men turn around there and later call it wisdom." Samuel laughed quietly. It sounded like a joke, but it made him uncomfortable. Upstairs, the lounge had grown warmer. Coats were off. Voices were loose. Malcolm told the younger students that dedication meant sacrifice. One of the students asked whether they should train before breakfast. Malcolm said recovery was important during conferences. Everyone accepted the answer because it was comfortable and sounded responsible. Bruce trained until the basement clock passed 1. He wiped the floor with a towel before leaving. Samuel watched him do it. A man who cleans after himself at 1 in the morning has already answered many questions about his character. Bruce thanked Samuel and went upstairs without asking whether anyone had missed him. The next morning, the lobby smelled of coffee and wet wool. Instructors gathered for the second day, speaking more slowly than the night before. Malcolm looked rested but heavy around the eyes. Frank rubbed his neck. Joseph complained about the hotel pillows. Bruce arrived quietly, fresh clothes, calm face. No announcement of the hours already spent. Samuel stood near the service door with a tray of cups. He watched the men greet each other. The talkers looked important again under the conference lights. Bruce looked ordinary unless you knew what had happened under the floor. Samuel knew, and that made ordinary look different. The first session was supposed to be a discussion about training habits. Malcolm volunteered to speak. He walked to the front and said, "Discipline is what separates serious men from performers." It was a good sentence. Bruce did not react. Samuel, carrying cups at the back, almost dropped one. Malcolm spoke for 15 minutes about commitment, sacrifice, and repetition. The room nodded. He had strong language and a voice made for leadership. Then the host asked whether anyone would demonstrate the difference between talking about discipline and practicing it under fatigue. A small laugh moved through the room. The host had meant nothing sharp by it, but the sentence landed near truth. Bruce looked down. Malcolm looked toward him. "Perhaps Mr. Lee can show us," he said, smiling. The smile was polite enough to deny malice and pointed enough to contain it. Bruce stood. "We can all show it," he said. That answer disturbed the room because it did not accept the trap. Malcolm had tried to put Bruce under the light. Bruce widened the light until it reached everyone. Adult confidence does that. It does not only defend itself, it changes the terms toward truth. Bruce asked for 3 volunteers, Malcolm, Frank, and 1 young student from the audience. The host looked uncertain but allowed it. Bruce placed them on the mat and gave a simple drill. 1 minute of footwork, 1 minute of hand entry, 1 minute of controlled response after fatigue. Malcolm smiled at the simplicity. Frank did too. The young student looked nervous. Bruce looked at all 3 and said, "Simple enough to reveal you." That line removed the comfort from the drill. Simple movements become dangerous when a man cannot hide behind complexity. The first minute began. Footwork only, no striking, no performance, Step, angle, reset. Malcolm looked sharp for 20 seconds. Frank looked strong for 30. The young student struggled early but listened carefully. Bruce watched the feet, not the faces. By the second minute, the room began to see the cost of last night. Malcolm's shoulders rose. Frank's steps grew louder. The young student, though less skilled, improved because he was not protecting a reputation. That detail mattered. Beginners can sometimes learn faster because they have less image to carry. Bruce stopped them halfway through. "Again from the beginning," he said. Malcolm frowned. "We are already working." Bruce nodded. "Yes, now work without negotiating with your fatigue." That line hit several older men in the room. Fatigue is where speeches start asking for exceptions. They began again. Malcolm tried harder and became worse. Frank laughed once, then stopped when the laugh cost him breath. The young student kept moving, clumsy but honest. Bruce corrected him first. Not because he was best, but because he was listening. Malcolm noticed. "You correct the beginner?" Bruce answered, "He is available to correction." The room went quiet. The sentence was not cruel, but it placed a mirror in front of Malcolm. Being advanced is supposed to make a man more correctable, not less. Bruce asked Malcolm to repeat the entry slowly. Malcolm did. Bruce adjusted his rear foot by 2 inches. Malcolm looked at the foot, then at Bruce, irritated. "I know the entry," he said. Bruce answered, "Then your foot should know it when tired." That was the first visible crack. The room understood. Knowledge spoken in the lounge had not become knowledge under fatigue. Bruce was not exposing Malcolm to embarrass him. He was showing the difference between owning a sentence and paying for it with the body. Frank received his correction next. His hands dropped after each entry. Bruce tapped his wrist lightly. "You tell stories with better guard than this," he said. Some students smiled. Frank laughed honestly, because the correction was too exact to resent completely. The drill continued. Sweat appeared on polished men. Their language disappeared. The mat became democratic in the old brutal way. It did not care who had spoken well the night before. It cared about angle, breath, timing, and whether a man remained present when comfort left. Samuel watched from the back. He understood now why Bruce had trained in the basement. The demonstration was not built in front of the room. It had been built when the room was sleeping. Public readiness is private repetition arriving on time. After the drill, Bruce did not announce that Malcolm had talked more than he trained. He did not need to. The men felt the difference themselves. A lesson felt by the body is harder to argue with than a lesson delivered as accusation. Malcolm breathed heavily and looked down at the mat. His pride searched for a defense. The drill was too simple. The carpet was strange. He had slept poorly. But excuses sound different when a young student next to you is improving because he is still listening. Bruce handed Malcolm a towel. The gesture mattered. He had corrected him publicly, then gave him dignity privately inside the same public moment. A man who wants humiliation withholds the towel. A man who wants learning offers it and moves on. Malcolm accepted it. That was his first win of the morning. Not the drill, not the speech. Accepting the towel without making a joke. Sometimes a grown man's progress begins with the small decision not to protect his image immediately. The host asked Bruce to explain the purpose. Bruce said, "Most men do not fail because they know nothing. They fail because what they know is not available when tired, insulted, afraid, or uncomfortable." The room listened because the mat had just confirmed it. He continued, "Talking can organize thought. That is useful. But talking can also become a substitute for payment. The body always asks for payment later." Malcolm looked up. The sentence felt less like an attack and more like an invoice. Frank said, "So we should never talk?" Bruce shook his head. Talk after the work has given you something honest to say. Talk to guide training, not to replace it. That distinction saved the lesson from becoming anti-intellectual. Bruce was not against words. He was against unpaid words. Joseph Park asked whether experience counted. Bruce nodded. Experience counts when it stays alive. If it only becomes stories, it begins to rot. Joseph did not like that, but he wrote it down. A sentence can offend a man and still help him. Malcolm finally spoke. "You think I only talk?" Bruce looked at him. "No, I think you talk like a man who used to train harder than he talks now." The room became still. That was more respectful than a softer lie would have been. The sentence hurt because it preserved Malcolm's past. Bruce did not say Malcolm had never worked. He said the balance had shifted. That is a different accusation and a more adult one. It allows a man to return instead of merely defend himself. Malcolm looked at the young student, then at his own feet. "Again," he said. The room shifted. This time the request came from him. Bruce nodded and reset the drill. Malcolm began again, slower, less polished, more available to correction. The second attempt was not heroic. It was better than heroic. It was honest. Malcolm's foot still drifted. His shoulders still rose. But he corrected sooner. He stopped performing endurance and started training it. Bruce gave small corrections and no praise until the work earned it. At the end of the second round, Malcolm was exhausted and clear. "I have been lecturing this drill for years," he said quietly. Bruce answered, "Then today it lectured back." Frank laughed. This time Malcolm did too. Not loudly, but enough to show pride loosening its grip. The room relaxed because laughter had changed sides. Last night, laughter belonged to comfort. Now it belonged to recognition. There is a clean kind of laughter that appears when men stop pretending they are finished. It does not weaken discipline. It refreshes it. Bruce asked everyone to pair off for 10 minutes. No speeches, no teaching titles, just the drill. Instructors worked with students. Students corrected instructors when allowed. The room became noisy with breath and feet instead of opinion. Samuel watched cups grow cold again, but now for a better reason. That image mattered. Coffee still went cold, but this time because men were working. The same object from the beginning returned with a different meaning. Cold coffee after talk is waste. Cold coffee after training is evidence that the body finally took priority. During the break, Malcolm sat alone on the bench. Bruce joined him, not to gloat, but because a corrected man often needs space that is not isolation. Malcolm said, "I was not always like this." Bruce answered, "Then you know the way back." Malcolm looked at him. "That's simple?" Bruce shook his head. "No, simple to name, hard to pay." Malcolm nodded. He understood payment now. His legs were shaking. His pride was quieter. His mouth had less to say, which made the words he did speak more useful. Samuel came by with water. Malcolm thanked him by name after reading the tag. Samuel looked surprised. Bruce noticed. A man humbled correctly often becomes more attentive to people he ignored while performing authority. That was a small but real change. Frank approached and admitted he had told the same tournament story too many times. "Maybe I miss being that man," he said. Bruce answered, "Then train today's man." Frank stared at him, then nodded slowly. That line had weight because aging fighters understand its pain. The conference changed after lunch. The panel discussions became shorter. Demonstrations became more honest. Men still spoke, but their words had sweat behind them. Malcolm began one session by saying, "I have been guilty of making discipline sound louder than I practice it." That public admission did more for his authority than another strong speech would have. Students do not need teachers who pretend to be finished. They need teachers who are still loyal to the work. Malcolm had lost some polish and gained credibility. Bruce did not take credit. He returned to the back wall during Malcolm's session and listened. That restraint mattered. He had created the pressure, but Malcolm had to own the correction. A man's growth is weakened if another man stands too close claiming it. Samuel later told a kitchen worker what he had seen in the basement. The worker asked if Bruce was showing off. Samuel shook his head. "No," he said. "That was the point. Nobody was there." He paused, then corrected himself. "I was there, but I do not think he was training for me." That sentence captured the whole difference. Training for witnesses and training with witnesses present are not the same. Bruce had not changed because Samuel saw him. The work had been happening before the witness became useful. That is discipline. The young student from the drill found Bruce after the session and asked how to stay consistent. Bruce said, "Do not wait until you feel like the man you want to become. Train so often that the feeling has to follow." The student wrote it down. Malcolm overheard and smiled faintly. He had given similar advice for years. Now hearing Bruce say it after the morning's test, the sentence seemed to demand more. Advice becomes heavier when the advisor has just paid for it. That night, the lounge filled again, but differently. Men still gathered around the same table. Coffee still arrived, but the first subject was not reputation. It was soreness, then corrections, then a plan to meet at 6 in the morning for another drill. Malcolm was the one who suggested 6. Frank groaned. Joseph asked whether 6:30 would be more realistic. Malcolm looked at Bruce, then at his coffee. 6, he said, not to impress anyone, to begin paying the invoice. Bruce did not say he would attend. He only smiled slightly. A man who trains does not need to announce every appointment with himself. The others understood enough now. 6 in the morning would reveal who had learned and who had only enjoyed the idea of learning. At 5:45 the next morning, Samuel passed the basement hallway and heard footsteps again. This time there were more of them. Malcolm stood inside the storage room, awkward and stiff, repeating the footwork in the same place Bruce had used the night before. Frank arrived 2 minutes later, still half asleep. Bruce was already there. He did not look surprised. He simply made room. That is how standards work. They do not congratulate you for arriving. They give you a place to begin and then ask whether you will keep going after arrival stops feeling special. The basement room that had held one man's discipline now held several men's discomfort. It smelled of laundry and effort. Samuel watched from the doorway with a grin he tried to hide. The talkers had come downstairs. That was the difference beginning to become visible. The drill was ugly at first. Feet scraped. Timing failed. Malcolm corrected himself before Bruce could. Frank cursed softly at his own shoulders. Joseph discovered that his balance was worse before breakfast. Bruce moved among them, giving small corrections, never letting the morning become ceremony. Ceremony would have ruined it. The point was not that they now trained in a basement once for a story. The point was whether they would return after the romance of correction faded. Discipline is what remains when the first inspiring morning becomes the third inconvenient one. Bruce told them that. Anyone can train after being embarrassed, he said. The question is whether you train after being comfortable again. Malcolm absorbed it. Comfort had been the enemy all along, not ignorance. He had known the words. Comfort had separated him from their cost. Frank asked Bruce if he never preferred talking. Bruce smiled. Talking is easier. That honest answer surprised them. Bruce continued, that is why it must earn its place. The men laughed, not because the sentence was funny, but because it was true enough to sting. By the end of the morning, nobody looked heroic. That was good. They looked older, sweatier, less certain, and more useful. Samuel brought water. Malcolm thanked him again. Frank helped move the crates back. Joseph wiped the floor without being asked. The basement had become a small court where speeches were tested. Not abolished, tested. Bruce never said talking was worthless. He simply made it impossible for talk to walk around unpaid. The body had become the cashier. This is the adult heart of the episode. Many men talk because they once worked. They are not frauds at first. They are former workers living off old receipts. The danger is subtle. Respect earned yesterday becomes a story told today, then a substitute for tomorrow's training. Bruce represented the interruption. Not a supernatural force, not a perfect saint. A man who did the work close enough to expose the unpaid words around him. He did not have to accuse every talker. His schedule accused them quietly. Malcolm's dignity came from accepting the accusation without collapsing into shame. He could have mocked the basement session. He could have claimed his age, rank, or teaching duties excused him. Instead, he returned. That choice saved him from becoming only a talker. Frank's dignity came from laughing at the truth and training today's man. Joseph's dignity came from writing down what offended him. Samuel's dignity came from noticing work and letting it change what he admired. Each man received a different correction from the same standard. The conference ended with fewer dramatic speeches than expected. The final panel was shorter and better. Malcolm said, "We should be careful not to become historians of our own discipline while our bodies become strangers to it." Nobody clapped immediately. They were thinking. Bruce listened from the side. That sentence was Malcolm's now. It had been purchased in the basement. When a man pays for a truth, his voice changes. The room can hear the difference. even if it cannot name the receipt. Afterwards, Samuel found the cold coffee cups from the first night still stacked in the service tray. He almost threw them away without thinking. Then he paused. Cold coffee from talking, cold coffee from training. Same object, different meaning. He smiled and carried them to the kitchen. The image is simple but strong. A cup can grow cold because men are wasting time, or because men are finally using it well. The difference is not in the cup. It is in what the men were doing while the cup waited. That is the whole episode in one object. Bruce trained while others talked. The difference was not that talking men were evil, or that silence is always virtue. The difference was payment. Bruce paid before speaking. The others spoke on credit. Credit eventually comes due. It came due in a simple drill under fatigue. It came due in Malcolm's drifting foot, Frank's dropping guard, Joseph's weak balance, and the beginner's honest improvement. The body collected every unpaid sentence. For viewers, the lesson is uncomfortable because everyone talks somewhere. We talk about the work, the plan, the comeback, the channel, the body, the business, the discipline we will begin when conditions improve. Talking gives the feeling of movement without the cost. Bruce's standard cuts through that. Do the work before the speech grows too comfortable. Let the body, the page, the product, the repetition, the actual finished thing give your words permission. Otherwise, your words may become a warm room hiding from a cold floor. The basement floor was cold. That is why it mattered. No one looked important there. No banner, no panel, no attentive student hanging on every phrase. Just feet, breath, correction, and the honest embarrassment of discovering that yesterday's reputation does not move today's body. That is masculine dignity in a practical form, not boasting about discipline, not shaming others for weakness, returning to the floor, paying again, cleaning the room after, thanking the worker who brought water, letting soreness teach what pride forgot. Bruce did those things quietly. Then when he spoke, the words had roots. That is why they landed differently. A rooted sentence does not need to be loud. It has weight because the man behind it has already carried it. Malcolm learned that his strongest future speeches would be shorter, not because he had less to say, but because work had taken back some of the space. When training returns, talk becomes sharper. It stops wandering. It begins to serve. Samuel learned a different lesson. He had been waiting for the men upstairs to show him what greatness looked like. Then he found greatness moving crates in a basement and wiping sweat from the floor. That changed what he admired. The young student learned not to fear being corrected more than being impressive. The beginner had improved because he listened. That gave him a kind of advantage over men with reputations. He did not carry enough history to hide behind. Bruce Lee's role was not to humiliate the talkers. It was to reveal the gap between their language and their practice, then offer a way back through work. That is the difference between cruelty and leadership. Cruelty exposes and leaves. Leadership exposes and points to the floor. The floor is always waiting. That is the quiet truth behind every discipline. After the speech, the floor waits. After the applause, the floor waits. After the excuse, the floor waits. After the old victory story, the floor waits. Bruce went to the floor while others went to the lounge. That was the difference. Not genetics, not mysticism, not a glowing legend. A choice repeated enough times that it became visible when pressure asked for proof. The final image should be the basement storage room at dawn. Crates pushed back, sweat on concrete, cold coffee upstairs forgotten, and several men drilling in silence. The talk has not vanished. It has been made accountable. That is a better ending than Bruce simply proving he trained harder. The room changed. Malcolm changed. Frank changed a little. Samuel's admiration changed. The young student's idea of discipline changed. Work moved from one man to several. A standard is strongest when it spreads without becoming a sermon. Bruce did not need to tell them he was disciplined. He showed where he was at midnight and again before sunrise. The rest of the room had to decide whether to remain comfortable. Some men did remain comfortable. That is realistic. Not everyone who hears a truth pays for it. A few returned home and kept telling the same stories. But enough men had seen the basement to make the first night's lounge talk feel thinner forever. That is all a story needs to be honest. Not total conversion, a crack in comfort, a visible standard, one or two men choosing the harder direction. Adult growth rarely moves the entire crowd. It begins with the few who can no longer enjoy the old excuse. Malcolm became one of the few. Months later, his students noticed he demonstrated more and lectured less. When he did lecture, he sometimes stopped himself and said, "Enough words. Show me your feet." That sentence came from the basement. Frank started training in the morning again, not every day at first, but enough to feel the difference between memory and current ability. Joseph changed his warm-up. Samuel began saving money for evening classes, not because of a speech, but because he had seen work up close. This is how Bruce Lee becomes a symbol in this episode. Not the man who talks better than the talkers, but the man whose work makes talk answerable. He represents the uncomfortable standard that asks, "What did you do while others discussed doing?" The answer defines more than martial arts. It defines business, art, family, fitness, character. Men often gather to discuss the life they want while avoiding the floor where that life is built. Bruce walked to the floor. That is why the title carries force. Bruce Lee trained while others talked, and that was the difference. Not because speech is useless, because speech without payment becomes theater. Work without announcement becomes authority. The coffee went cold twice. The first time it exposed men hiding in language. The second time, it waited while men worked. Same cup, different men. That is the transformation the episode should leave in the viewer's mind. And when the conference ended, the basement storage room returned to being ordinary. Towels, pipes, crates, concrete. But for the men who trained there, it was no longer ordinary. It was the place where their words met the bill. Bruce left without claiming that place. He did not need to. His standard remained in the sore legs, the shortened speeches, the clean floor, and the uncomfortable memory of cold coffee beside unfinished work. The final lesson is simple. Talk if it helps the work. Stop when it replaces the work. Train when nobody's watching. Then when the room asks what separates serious men from performers, your body will answer before your mouth needs to. That answer is what Malcolm had been missing. He had the language of discipline, but Bruce still had the daily relationship with it. The difference was not knowledge, it was contact. Bruce stayed in contact with the thing Malcolm had begun describing from a distance. Distance can happen quietly to successful men. First they train, then they teach. Then they speak about training more than they feel it. Then the memory of effort starts standing in for effort itself. Bruce's presence made that distance visible. The cure was not shame. Shame might send a man to the floor once. Discipline brings him back after shame fades. That is why the second morning mattered more than the first demonstration. The men returned before the audience gathered. Returning before the audience is one of the cleanest signs of change. It means the work has stopped being a performance and started becoming a responsibility. Bruce had lived there already. The others were just finding the door. For the viewer, the door is always near. The notebook, the mat, the camera, the gym, the script, the practice room, the quiet hour before excuses wake. Every man has a basement where the real work could happen if he stopped negotiating with comfort. Bruce's gift in this story is not that he shames talk. It is that he restores proportion. Words should serve action. Memory should serve present work. Experience should serve correction. Rank should serve responsibility. When those things reverse, a man becomes a performer of his own discipline. Malcolm was not beyond saving because he still recognized the bill when it arrived. That is important. A completely arrogant man tears up the invoice. A recoverable man hates it, then pays. Malcolm paid in sweat, embarrassment, and a 6 o'clock return. The story should end with that return, not with the public drill. The public drill exposes. The return redeems. Bruce's difference was consistency. Malcolm's first step back toward dignity was choosing consistency after being exposed. And that is the adult lesson. Do not only admire the man who works while others talk. Become harder to separate from your own work. Let your private discipline become so steady that your public words cannot drift too far from the truth. Bruce trained while others talked. The difference was not noise versus silence. It was paid versus unpaid. His words had paid. His movement had paid. His confidence had paid. And when pressure came to collect, he had a receipt the body could read. The men who came downstairs were not suddenly superior to the men who stayed upstairs. They were simply more honest at that moment. That distinction matters. Discipline is not a personality trait a man owns forever. It is a relationship he must renew before comfort talks him out of it. Malcolm learned that renewal is quieter than reputation. Reputation asks, do they still respect me? Renewal asks, did I still do the work today? One question looks outward and becomes hungry. The other looks toward the floor and becomes useful. Bruce's greatness in the episode is that he makes renewal visible without preaching it first. He trains in a poor room, with poor equipment, at a poor hour, because the work does not always wait for ideal conditions. That is the difference between a wish and a standard. Samuel understood it in the simplest way. The men upstairs had sounded like martial artists. The man downstairs looked like one even when no one needed him to. That changed Samuel's idea of respect. He stopped admiring the loudest table and began watching for the quietest work. Years later, when Samuel told the story, he did not remember every technique. He remembered Bruce pushing crates back into place, wiping the floor, thanking him, and returning before sunrise. Those details stayed because they were not designed to impress him. They were just how the man worked. That is the kind of detail adult viewers trust. A huge speech can be performed. A dramatic demonstration can be staged. But consistency in small, inconvenient actions is hard to fake for long. It carries a different smell. Men recognize it when they have paid for something themselves. Malcolm eventually turned the cold coffee into a rule at his school. If students gathered too long around talk before training, he would point at the cups and say, "Let the coffee get cold for the right reason." They laughed, then moved. That rule was not about coffee. It was about priority. Anything can wait while a man talks. The question is whether the work is also waiting. Bruce's lesson was that talk should stand in line behind practice, not sit at the head of the table pretending to be practice. The final image should hold both floors at once. Above, the lounge table with cold cups and empty chairs. Below, the basement floor with sweat, towels, and men drilling. Same hotel, same night. Two futures. One speaks about discipline. The other becomes slightly more worthy of the word. And that is why Bruce trained while others talked.